Nunc cognosco ex part Thomas J. Battle Library, Trent University. Digitized by the Internet Archive in 2019 with funding from Kala/Austin Foundation. https://archive.org/details/gargoyles gentlemomil. A History of St. Paul's Cathedral, London, Ontario 1834–1964 I Toronto The Ryerson Press. Copyright Rector and Wardens of St. Paul's Cathedral, London, Ontario 1966 Printed and bound in Canada by the Ryerson Press, Toronto. This book is respectfully dedicated to the Right Reverend George Naismith Luxton, B.A., D.D., Doctor of Laws, Lord Bishop of Huron, and the Very Reverend Kenneth Bernard Keefe, D.D., Dean of Huron. Contents: Prologue 11 Wilderness 1 Mission 8 Plague 22 Church 29 Fire 37 Phoenix 49 Prosperity 62 Cathedral 81 War 89 Dean Helmuth 104 Debt 116 Dedication 125 War and Peace 133 War and Peace, Continued, 143 Charity 152 Appendices 159. Illustrations London, Canada West, 1840 68 St. Paul's Cathedral and Deanery, 1870 68 St. Paul's Cathedral. Ground plan showing new transepts and chancel 68 St. Paul's Cathedral. Plan of additions 68 St. Paul's Cathedral and Synod buildings. Perspective view 69 The Right Reverend Benjamin Cronin 69 The Right Reverend Isaac Helmuth 69 The Very Reverend George Mignon Innes 100 The Reverend Canon Alfred George Dan 100 The Very Reverend Louis Norman Tucker 100 The Very Reverend Charles Edward Jakins 100 The Very Reverend Percival Nathaniel Harding 101 The Right Reverend George Naismith Luxton 101 The Very Reverend Richard Charles Brown 101 The Very Reverend Kenneth Bernard Keefe 101. Prologue In one respect at least, time has been kind to the old church. The community she serves has expanded more than 30-fold in the 117 years since she was built. The motor omnibus has replaced the stagecoach and the convertible, the brougham, but the elegant vista that enchanted her architect survives to delight the eye of the 20th century visitor. Progress has hemmed her in with brick and steel and mortar, but her view of the valley of the Canadian Thames, whose waters bore her vice-regal sponsor to the site of the city nearly 2 centuries ago, is still unobstructed by anything but the trees that verge the river and the high board fence around the riverside estate of one of her early supporters, Captain John Harris, R.N. R.E.T. History came to St. Paul's Cathedral down Fullerton Street, which commemorates the wife of an early parishioner. Fullerton Street is 2 blocks long. At one end is the cathedral, at the other the Harris estate. The neat cottages with their white picket fences that once framed the view of the river from St. Paul's have given place to office buildings, industrial establishments, and used car lots, but nothing else has changed. The 2 blocks of Fullerton Street represent the past. St. Paul's resolutely faces the past with her faded pink-tinted porch, while her high-hipped, red-bricked rear spurns the mushrooming metropolis behind her. St. Paul's history. Her records take us back to colonial days, and her tattered battle flags bring us down the years to Ypres and Dieppe. To the mind oppressed by the nuclear policy of nations, yesterday is easier to contemplate than tomorrow, and St. Paul's is yesterday. Prologue. To her doors once came the members of the minor establishment. The merchant princes, the lettered and unlettered colonial Squire Archie, the braided martinets, the money lenders and the factory owners, the financially embarrassed sons of peers and the enriched daughters of nobodies, the politically proud and the temporally meek, the shapers of history and the fomenters of rebellion. Her bells have tolled for knights and condemned criminals, for weddings and days of national mourning, to signal victory and to herald calamity, to praise God and to honor the King. She is a church, a beached ship, the Ark of the Covenant, a building of weathered brick and wood. By herself, she is this and nothing more. It is the lives she has blessed, the loves she has sanctified, the deaths she has glorified, that make her worthy of record. This is the story of the priests and people of St. Paul's, London, Ontario, Cathedral Church of the Anglican Diocese of Huron. Wilderness. What went ye out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken with the wind? But what went ye out for to see? A man clothed in soft raiment? Behold, they that wear soft clothing are in kings' houses. Matthew 11, 7-8. When the first permanent settlers came to southwestern Ontario, the peninsula was thickly blanketed by a forest of great age, a wilderness of immense trees. The untouched forest was hated or loved, depending on the psychology of the observer and his reason for being there. The Indians and the French coureurs de bois saw it in one light, the nature-loving European travelers of the 18th and early 19th centuries, in another. The white settlers loathed it. The first two groups, being illiterate, left no record of their feelings about the forest. We can only speculate. The third group has left us a library of rich and ornate prose. One of the most romantic of these is the account written in 1721 by Father Pierre-François Xavier de Charlevoix of a journey by canoe along the north shore of Lake Erie. In a much-quoted passage which was later to influence the policy of the first lieutenant governor of the province, the good father declaims in lyrical prose, "Wherever I went ashore I was quite enchanted by the beauty and variety of a landscape which was terminated by the noblest forests in the whole world. Were we always to sail as I did, with a serene sky in a most charming climate, and on water as clear as the purest fountain, we might possibly be tempted to travel so to the end of our days." This is almost pure Rousseau. The noble forests and the crystal waters are treated as a painted backdrop for a portrait of the noble savage. Nothing is said of the clouds of black flies by day and mosquitoes by night, or of the stench of the Indian villages. Nothing is said of the perpetual twilight that prevailed in the woods, or the effect of these dark and grim surroundings on the minds of men, civilized and uncivilized alike. Accustomed as we are to the tame, second-growth saplings that timber the woodlets and the remaining waste spaces of the peninsula today, we are inclined to underestimate the task that faced the settlers in clearing their land. The term forest giant was no hyperbole. These great trees frequently towered 200 feet into the wilderness skies and were packed as tightly together as sardines in a can. A keen-eyed American traveler described the pine woods between Ingersoll and London in 1832 in these words: "A short distance further westward our road leads us into a dense forest, exclusively of white pine. The mind of man can hardly image a more interesting wilderness scene than is here presented to the eye of the tourist. The regular and elegant wall of trees on either hand, whose spiral tops reach, seemingly, to the heavens, their beautiful evergreen hue, the deep impervious shade beneath their small and straight yet intertwining branches, all, viewed together, appears at once pleasing, sublime, and solemn. Some of the trees are very large, and in no other place have I seen a forest so compact, such a vast quantity of timber on any particular space of ground. In sum, the Ontario forest as it stood at the beginning of the 19th century was a wonderful subject for descriptive prose, but a terrifying and oppressive setting for a home. In other words, it was a fine place to visit, but who would want to live there? Apparently quite a few people did. They began coming in the last decade of the 18th century. They came, not because of the scenic attractions of the province, but because it offered a refuge from persecution. The War of the American Revolution, which cost Britain her North American colonies, left several thousand Royalist supporters either homeless, or hounded by their Republican neighbors. 10,000 of these United Empire Loyalists poured into the Virgin Territories west of Montreal after the signing of the peace in 1784. With them they brought their church, the Church of England. The first shepherds of the flock were army chaplains, and the first churches were small chapels in the various army barracks. In southwestern Ontario, the first chaplain was probably attached to Butler's Rangers, and the first chapel was at the Rangers' headquarters in Fort Niagara on the American side of the Niagara River. After the signing of the peace, services were conducted at Butlersbury, now the village of Niagara-on-the-Lake, on the Canadian side. The first separate Anglican church building to be erected in Ontario still stands, Her Majesty's Chapel of the Mohawks, near Brantford, built in 1787. With the help of their chaplain, the Reverend Dr. John Stewart, the Anglican Mohawks of the Six Nations Confederacy removed from their ancient home in New York State to the Grand River after the close of the war, bringing with them some of the silver communion vessels given them by Auen in 1712. The first communion service to be held in the present Diocese of Huron was celebrated in this church by Dr. Stewart in June, 1784. The Canada Act, passed by the British Parliament in 1791, set aside the newly settled region west of Montreal as a new province to be known as Upper Canada. With the passage of the Act, the appointment of Colonel John Graves Simcoe, a veteran of the American Revolutionary War, as the first lieutenant governor, and the setting aside of certain wild lands for the support of a Protestant clergy, the work of the Church of England on the frontier was put on a more formal basis. Prior to the passage of the Act, the Right Reverend Charles Inglis, first Bishop of Nova Scotia, whose ecclesiastical jurisdiction included as well the British colonies of Upper and Lower Canada, New Brunswick, Bermuda, and Newfoundland, appealed to the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, SPG, for a missionary to serve the Niagara region where there was a numerous settlement of Loyalists. With the financial assistance of a number of the leading residents of the area including Colonel John Butler, commander of the disbanded corps bearing his name, a missionary priest was appointed in 1791. He was the Reverend Robert Addison, a graduate of Trinity College, Cambridge. Addison arrived at Butler's Ferry, which by then had changed its name to Newark, in the summer of 1792. The village was to be his home and the headquarters for his labors for the next 30-7 years. Soon after his arrival, work was begun on the building of a church at Newark St. Mark's. Today one of the oldest church buildings in the province. St. Mark's, the Chapel of the Mohawks, and the Pioneer Church at Sandwich, presided over by the Reverend Richard Pollard, former Sheriff of Detroit, were the first three Anglican churches of the Western Peninsula. Before the 18th century was out, a fourth church was being built at the village of Delaware, in Middlesex County. Ebenezer Allen, founder of Rochester, New York, as well as of Delaware Village, was the church's builder. Nothing in his previous career prepares us for the picture of Allen as a dedicated churchman. Born in New Jersey, he lived a relatively uneventful and colorless life as a miller until the approach of his 40th birthday, when the American colonies revolted against the rule of Britain. From that time on until his death in 1816, Allen endured enough excitement to satisfy three normal men. A close acquaintance with the ways of the Indians, gained during the French-Indian Wars of the mid-18th century, led him into service as a scout attached to the Loyalist forces at Fort Niagara. Colonel John Butler of Butler's Rangers and Colonel John Johnson of the Indian Department employed him on many delicate missions. From this work and his polygamous habits among the Aborigines, he gained the nickname Indian Allen. Allen took on many of the characteristics of his Indian friends, including a sometimes shaky loyalty to the British cause. Not to put too fine a point on it, he turned his coat on occasion and worked for and with the rebels. As a result of one such final escapade, he ended his war service as a prisoner in the military jail at Montreal. After the signing of the peace in 1784, he returned to the American side and built a mill on the Genesee River, which became the nucleus of Rochester. Subsequently, learning of the free lands available in Upper Canada, he reminded the new Lieutenant Governor, Colonel John Graves Simcoe, of his services to the Crown and asked for a grant of 2,000 acres in what is now the county of Middlesex. Simcoe was at this time on a tour of the Western country, during which he visited the present site of the City of London. He was much taken by the military advantages of the site at the forks of a partially navigable stream, some distance from the American border, and determined that he would locate here the capital of the new province. He renamed the river, previously called by the Indians Ascunsipi, Antlered River, and by the French, La Tranche, as the Thames. His proposed capital he called London. His plan was vetoed by the Home Office in England, but the names London and Thames continued to be applied in the region. When the province was divided into administrative districts in 1801, was named the District of London. It was a very large tract, extending from Lake Erie to Lake Huron and from the town of Simcoe on the east almost to Chatham on the west. When the townships within the district were surveyed, that immediately to the north of the forks of the Thames River was also named after Simcoe's projected capital. In spite of Indian Allen's checkered career, his request for land was viewed favorably by Simcoe and he was granted a large block of land in Delaware Township, west of London, on certain conditions. He was to erect on the site, within a reasonable time, a mill and a church to serve as the nucleus for a settlement. The church, of course, was intended for use by the Church of England. The mill was apparently completed, but nothing more than the frame of the church was ever erected. It seems that Allen ran out of money before he could finish the job. Being in this case, as ever a resourceful man, he endeavored to repair the deficiency by coining the required number of Spanish pieces of 8 in the basement of the mill. His counterfeits of the 8 real piece, often called a Mexican dollar, legalized currency of the province of Upper Canada under one of the first acts of the provincial legislature, were obviously artistically inadequate, for the unfeeling authorities arrested him and salted him away in the district dungeon in the Long Point area for an undetermined period. The skeleton of the first Anglican church in Middlesex County mouldered away without ever having witnessed a service. Its builder's later career fulfilled earlier expectations. Allen saw the inside of the London District Jail on at least one other occasion, the charge being theft of an axe. No one ever saw fit to charge him with the obvious offence of bigamy, in spite of the fact that at one time his menage at Delaware included 4 wives, 2 white and 2 Indian. In the light of his previous war record, Allen came under the suspicion of the military authorities during the War of 1812 to 1814. A one-time neighbor, close friend, and fellow Indian scout, Andrew Westbrook, deserted to the American forces early in the war and organized a band of brigands who periodically ravaged the settlements in the interior of the peninsula. Allen was suspected of giving aid and comfort to his old friend, but the charge seems to have been unsubstantiated. The graying old rogue died on his farm at Delaware in 1816, paterfamilias to a large assortment of genetically varied offspring, one at least of whom achieved a posthumous notoriety almost the equal of his parent by being tortured to death by Sioux Indians during the California Gold Rush. The ravages of the war with the United States, together with the effects of a widespread crop failure in 1816, the year without a summer, left the western settlements decimated and badly shaken. By 1818, however, the townships were beginning to fill up with a tide of United Kingdom immigrants, forced from their homes by the acute financial depression of the post-Napoleonic period. Among the immigrants were both church and chapel folk, with perhaps a preponderance of the former. Some of the earliest members of the congregation of St. Paul's Cathedral were among these arrivals, among them the Carling and Cornish families. Among the first to arrive was Richard S. Talbot, an Anglican country squire from Tipperary County, Ireland, who brought with him a complete settlement of Tipperary Protestants. An account of their arrival appeared in the Gleaner, an early newspaper published in the town of Niagara, in its issue of September 17, 1818. Arrived on Sunday morning on board the schooner Caledonia, 50 settlers from the county of Tipperary, Ireland, accompanied by a gentleman from that place of the name of Richard Talbot, who, by an arrangement made with Lord Bathurst by advancing £10 with each adult, had their passage across the Atlantic provided for them and 5 weeks' provision, with a promise of 100 acres of land to each male above 17 years of age. The money advanced to be refunded as soon as they are settled upon their lands. 160 came out with Mr. Talbot under that arrangement, viz. 60 males and 100 females. The Talbot settlers established themselves in London Township, a few miles north of the present city. The names of these settlers, their leader, and his talented sons appear many times in the records of the Anglican Church in the London area. It is probable that some of these sturdy Irishmen met the Honourable and Reverend Charles James Stewart, first formal missionary of the SPG, on his visit to the western area in 1820. Certainly most of the colony met him on his second tour 2 years later, described in the next chapter. Stewart, a son of the Earl of Galloway, entered the Canadian missionary field in 1807, working first for several years in the eastern townships of Quebec. After the War of 1812, he returned to England to obtain financial and moral support for extended Canadian missions. Having received it, he mapped out an extensive tour of the western part of the province. Because of his dedicated work in Lower Canada, Stuart has been called the Apostle of the Eastern Townships. He deserves a similar acknowledgement for his work in Western Upper Canada. He may with justice be called the father of the Anglican Church in the London area. His missionary visits of 1820 and 1822 led directly to the establishment of the Congregation of St. Paul's, London. Mission. When he, Jesus, saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion on them, because they fainted and were scattered abroad, as sheep having no shepherd. Then saith he unto his disciples, The harvest truly is plenteous, but the labourers are few. Pray ye therefore the Lord of the harvest, that he will send forth labourers into his harvest. Matthew 9, 36-38 St. Paul's congregation came into being as a direct result of the second missionary journey to the western portion of the province of Upper Canada by the Honourable and Reverend Dr. Charles James Stuart. On this visit, in the summer of 1822, Dr. Stuart preached in a barn in London Township to a surprisingly large congregation of 250 persons. He baptized their children, performed a number of marriages and promised he would try to get them a clergyman. In a report subsequently made to the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, however, he merely stated that in the townships of Oxford, Westminster, and London, the numbers of settlers was rapidly increasing and, notwithstanding the variety of sects into which the people are divided, it is reasonable to hope that in a short time they will have become sensible of the advantages which arise from an ecclesiastical establishment and, availing themselves of the offers of the Society, will unite their efforts in the building of churches. Despite the non-committal nature of his report, Dr. Stuart eventually kept his promise to the London Township settlers. By the time he did so, however, he had become bishop of the vast diocese of Quebec, and a new, raw little town at the forks of the Canadian Thames River had usurped the priority of the earlier settlement to the north of it. Dr. Stuart was consecrated Bishop of Quebec on January 21, 1826. In that same month the legislature of Upper Canada decided to relocate the judicial offices of the huge administrative district of London. The district, named for Lieutenant Governor Simcoe's dream capital of Upper Canada, took in the territory of some 7 modern Western Ontario counties. Courts for this enormous region had previously been held in the little village of Victoria, in Norfolk County. When the courts were first established there, Victoria was the centre of the most extensive settlement in the district. By 1826, however, the western townships were rapidly filling up, as Dr. Stuart had indicated, and numerous complaints were being registered by the residents of Middlesex County at the excessive distances they were obliged to travel to transact legal business. It was decided therefore to relocate the capital in a more central area. The tiny villages of St. Thomas and Delaware set up a noisy clamour for the honour, overdoing it to the extent that the legislators chose neither but selected a compromise site, declaring it expedient to establish the district town at the reservation heretofore made for a town near the forks of the River Thames, in the townships of Westminster and London. It was in this manner that Simcoe's dream city of London, Canada finally achieved reality, not, it is true, as the capital of the province but at least as the capital of a district. Political expediency was combined with sentimentality in the choice of the site, for the prime mover in the selection was Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Talbot, who had been Simcoe's aide-de-camp on his visit to the area in 1793. Certainly the site was chosen without regard to the nature of the terrain. London had been settled for nearly 50 years before the last of the bogs, marshes, stream beds and quicksand deposits were filled in, covered over, or drained. Many of them still lie in wait for unsuspecting contractors. The survey of the site was completed in the late summer of 1826, and the first building, a log shanty doubling as a house and inn, was erected by one of the chain bearers on the survey party, Peter McGregor, on October 1. Almost immediately thereafter construction began of a two-story frame building to serve as a temporary courthouse and jail. It was used for the first time at the sitting of the Court of Assizes in January, 1827. The first building to be built in London was a tavern, and the second, a jail, a reasonably logical sequence of events. There was no Anglican church for some time, and there exists no record of regular church services of any denomination for the first 2 years. Time not spent by the handful of inhabitants in the pursuit of their daily labors seems to have been expended in libations and litigation. The picture commonly presented of the earliest pioneers of Ontario as God-fearing, trusting and trustworthy subjects of the king is not borne out by the court records. In London, as in most of the smaller and newer towns and villages throughout the province, the Methodist circuit riders were the first to bring the gospel to the people. They lived off the land and were not bound by the cumbersome ecclesiastical machinery of the more orthodox and established churches. Occasionally the Methodists ran foul of the law which had established the Church of England as the state church of Upper Canada. Under the establishment, marriages could be performed only by an Anglican priest, by publication of banns or license, or by an authorized justice of the peace, by license only. Shortly after the close of the War of 1812, one Henry Ryan, a Methodist circuit rider, performed an illegal marriage ceremony in Westminster Township, south of London. He was charged with the offence, arrested, tried and found guilty. His sentence was barbarous transportation for 14 years to the penal colony of Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania. The indignation of the Methodists of Upper Canada was intense, and its effects were almost immediately felt by the provincial authorities. The sentence was suspended and Ryan went free, but the incident played its part in the eventual disestablishment of the Church of England. The case of Henry Ryan shows the continuing efforts of the evangelical churches to obtain footholds in the back country areas. Although no reliable records are available, it is more than likely that some form of Methodist services, albeit on a sporadic basis, were available to the citizens of the infant community of London almost from the beginning. There are fleeting glimpses of missionary visits by Roman Catholic priests to the settlement in its first 2 years, and an occasional notation of baptisms and marriages performed by the Reverend Alexander Mackintosh, Anglican priest at the mission in St. Thomas, 18 miles south of London, which was opened in 1824. Since Mackintosh, in addition to his regular charge in St. Thomas, was responsible also for 5 other stations in as many different townships, his statement respecting London Village that the service is performed almost too seldom to be denominated occasional was only too true. On August 2, 1828, Bishop Stewart again visited the area and held a service in the temporary courthouse. On that occasion representations were made to him of the need for a missionary in the village. It took the bishop just over a year to find the funds and the man to establish a mission in London. The funds were supplied by the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. The man was the Reverend Edward Jukes Boswell. Boswell was born in England in 1798. He was ordained deacon in 1827, but whether in England or Canada cannot now be determined, and posted to St. John's Sandwich on the Detroit River frontier. He was transferred from that parish with orders to set up the London Mission in August, 1829. He was priest by Bishop Stewart the following year. The exact date of Boswell's arrival in London is not known, but he performed 7 baptisms in the village on August 23, 1829. These are the first entries in the earliest register of St. Paul's Cathedral, a fine rag paper ledger carrying an 1825 watermark. The names of the parents and sponsors in the first group of records form direct links with the earliest settlements in the western portion of the province. Benjamin Scram and John Freely were sons of members of Colonel John Butler's Corps of Rangers. Their fathers had attended services conducted by the Reverend John Addison at Fort Niagara and later at Butler's Ferry. Catherine Dingman was the daughter of a ranger. Francis Lewis, Alexander Guffin, Rebecca Ardell, Maria Sifton, Margaret Shoebottom, and Anne Talbot were members of the Irish Anglican settlement established a few miles north of London by Richard Talbot of Tipperary in 1818. Most of them had probably attended the service conducted in Geary's barn by Dr. Stewart in 1822. One or two of the names in these first entries have a distinctly un-Anglican sound. Hugh McCandless and Felix McLaughlin were probably not members of the Church of England, but when it came to the important business of baptizing one's child into the kingdom of God, an Anglican padre in hand was better than two Roman Catholic priests in the bush. Ecumenicity was not a doctrine of the early settlers so much as it was a necessity. The names imposed upon the helpless babes were typical of the times: Mary, Catherine, John, Deborah, Elizabeth, Sally, Adam, and Rosina. With the exception of the last named, they were all good, staunch, roast beef and Yorkshire pudding kinds of names. During the 3 years he was stationed in London, Edward Boswell baptized 159 children and adults. Most of the Sarahs and Bettys and Ralphs and Williams and Isaacs and Johns and Henrys are lost to history, their memories preserved only in half-forgotten family records or half-obliterated memorial stones. However, 4 of those who were marked with the Sign of Christ are still remembered for achievements in politics and on the stage, and for notoriety in the gentle art of dying. The first of the quartet was John, son of Thomas and Margaret Carling, born January 23, 1828, in the township of London and baptized by E. J. Boswell in the village of London on April 11, 1830. John Carling, together with his brother Isaac, 3 years his senior but baptized on the same day, later founded the Carling breweries. John entered politics in the 1850s, first as a member of London's Municipal Council and later as a federal member of Parliament. He played an active part in both the pre- and post-Confederation national planning, became a federal minister of agriculture and was knighted by Queen Victoria in 1893. From the first establishment of the Congregation of St. Paul's to the present, the Carling family has played an active and honourable role in the work of the Anglican Church of Canada. So much cannot be said for the second member of the quartet, although it cannot be denied that he made his mark. Francis Evans Cornish, the son of William King Cornish and Elizabeth Catherine his wife, was born also in London Township, on February 1, 1831, and was baptized by E. J. Boswell on the 27th of the same month. Cornish followed his father into the profession of the law and in the mid-1850s became one of the youngest Queen's councillors ever to be named in Canada. Soon thereafter he entered municipal politics and after serving a couple of terms as alderman, was elected mayor in 1861. He retained the post for 4 years by the exercise of techniques that put the worst days of Tammany Hall to shame. He was only ousted from the mayoralty when his fellow councillors called out the militia to ensure an honest election. Cornish's public and private career was highlighted by charges of bigamy, assault, and drunkenness, and by noisy, public disputes with the Commander-in-Chief of the British Armed Forces in Canada, the London Chief of Police, and other assorted local and national dignitaries. He was a legendary figure during and after his lifetime and ended his days as first mayor of the city of Winnipeg and first member of the Federated Parliament for the riding of Poplar Point, a campaign which he won by the simple expedient of kidnapping his opponent on the eve of the election. So much for now. The shadow of Francis Evans Cornish will fall frequently on these pages. Graves Simcoe Lee, the third of the 4 famous persons baptized by E. J. Boswell, was born in the village of London on December 1, 1828, and baptized on September 28, 1831. He was the son of Dr. Hiram Davis Lee and his wife Anne, Terry, Lee, both of whom were children of United Empire Loyalists. Their son, Graves Simcoe, was named in honour of the first lieutenant governor of the province. The Lees had been physicians for generations, first in England and later in Connecticut and in Upper Canada. Graves Simcoe was destined for the same profession. However, in early youth he became fascinated by the amateur theatricals staged by the officers of the British garrison, then stationed in London, and took part in some of their plays. From the moment he first appeared on the stage he was lost to medicine and eventually made his way to the professional American stage, where he became one of the brighter lights of Broadway and the touring companies in the 1860s. He was the first of an illustrious line of theatrical celebrities, both amateur and professional, who claimed London as their hometown and St. Paul's as their home parish. The fourth VIP to be baptized by young Mr. Boswell was notorious rather than famous. His head became known to more persons through the civilized world than that of any other single, named person in history. So far as is known, the owners of the original Neanderthal skull and the Piltdown forgery were never christened. However, he was never in a position adequately to appreciate his fame, which came to him posthumously. Properly to tell the story of Cornelius Alverson Burley, it is necessary to recreate as nearly as possible conditions in the village of London as they existed in the summer of 1830. It may be that this is the best way of telling the story of the earliest days of the mission which became St. Paul's Parish. Besides, it will increase the suspense. Between his arrival in late August and the end of the year 1829, Boswell was kept busy organizing his congregation and performing marriages, 14, and baptisms, 16. Services were held in the homes of leading Anglicans, there being no church or building set aside for that purpose. The missionary attempted to rectify this situation by appearing before the Justices of the Peace in General Quarter Sessions assembled in January 1830, to ask permission to use a room in the nearly completed new courthouse for the purpose of Sunday services. On January 16 he received a letter from Colonel Mahlon Burwell, chairman of the sessions, and a staunch Anglican: "The receipt of your favour respecting the want of a house in which to perform divine service and requesting permission to use the courtroom is acknowledged. The magistrates instruct me to inform you that, as the courthouse is the property of the district, erected for the only purpose of accommodating His Majesty's courts of law in the administration of justice, they do not conceive that they possess the right of granting you your request." Parenthetically, it may be commented that many of Colonel Burwell's fellow magistrates were Methodists. The courthouse here referred to was not the frame building constructed in 1827, but a handsome new permanent structure modelled along the lines of Malahide Castle near Dublin, Ireland, ancestral home of Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Talbot. Most early travellers, unaware of the delicate compliment being paid to the redoubtable colonel, referred to it in rather slighting terms as being somewhat Gothic. It was also somewhat expensive for the time and the place, having cost more than £4,000, provincial currency, equal to $16,000 American. Boswell subsequently received permission to hold Sunday services in the schoolhouse on the main square. This was the old temporary courthouse. From its erection in 1827 until the completion of the permanent building, it had served a triple purpose as courthouse, jail, and school. The rear half of the first floor, reinforced with logs, palisade fashion, was the jail. The front half contained the courtroom, and school was kept in the loft. After the cells and legal offices were removed, the whole building was turned over to the use of the grammar school authorities. A grammar school was an early 19th century version of a modern secondary school. The curriculum was heavy on the classics and Italian. Dance was pretty well limited to the better families. This hastily built but well-constructed frame building was home for the congregation of St. Paul's for a total of nearly 5 years. It stood without major alteration for a century until torn down to make way for the London City Police Station in the mid-1920s. While the courtroom in the new building was already in use by January 1830, prisoners were still being lodged in the temporary structure. The most celebrated prisoner of the year was Cornelius Burley. Con Burley had been charged with a petty theft in the fall of 1829 and a warrant issued for his arrest. A district constable, Timothy Conklin Pomeroy, was assigned to execute the warrant. He tracked Burley to his home neighborhood in Bayham Township on Lake Erie. Burley, being warned of the constable's approach, hid out in the bush. Con, a farm laborer whose mentality approached submoronic level, was terrified at the prospect of arrest. At least one man had actually been hanged in the district for theft under the brutal and as yet unreformed English criminal code. Khan feared the worst and in his extremity turned to some friends, 3 male members of a family named Ribble. The Ribbles sheltered him for some time until Constable Pomeroy smelled them out. One dark night on a lonely forest road, Tim Pomeroy walked into an ambush. A shot was fired and Tim died. An investigation was immediately launched. Search of the murder site revealed a single clue: an abandoned cap, subsequently identified as the property of Con Burley. Burley and the 3 Ribbles were arrested and lodged in the primitive jail at London to await trial at the Spring Assizes. The case was duly reported in London's 2 newspapers. So rapidly had the village grown in importance in its less than 4 years of existence that 2 enterprising residents had seen fit to risk their capital in the effort to meet its need for communication media. As one of the 2 proprietors stated in his flowery prospectus, "Enjoying all the blessings of our unparalleled constitution. We need only the aid of that powerful engine tire press, to spread throughout the world a knowledge of our situation and invite from every nation, the industrious and enterprising. Feeling this to be our situation and anxious to see the whole wilderness converted into smiling fields and the abode of the wolf and the haunt of the savage become the asylums of the sons and daughters of liberty and civilization, we have determined, by the establishment of a press in London, to contribute our mite towards the attainment of those ends." The author of this magnificent specimen of hyperbole was an Anglican and a member of Reverend M.R. Boswell's congregation. He was Edward Allen Talbot, son of the Richard Talbot whose group of Irish emigrants inaugurated the first large-scale settlement in London Township in 1818. The young Talbot was not only London's first newspaper editor, but the author at 20 years of age of one of the most widely circulated books on settlement in Upper Canada, 5 years' residence in the Canadas, published in England in 1824. Talbot's paper, the London Sun, was a secular weekly. The rival journal was ostensibly a religious paper called the Wesleyan Advocate, a semi-official organ of the Wesleyan Methodist Church. Its editor was, in his way, every bit as colorful as the editor of the Sun. He was the Reverend James Jackson, a native of the United States and a cousin of General Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory, victor of the Battle of New Orleans, 1815, who became the 7th President of the United States. London, incidentally, was well supplied with kin of famous Americans at this period. John and Oliver McClary, London residents who later founded the McClary Manufacturing Company, now General Steel Wares, were cousins of John Adams, 2nd President of the United States, and John Quincy Adams, 6th President. Before the Spring Assizes were held, both newspapers had occasion to print a sensational story. There had been a wholesale break of prisoners from the makeshift jail. All the prisoners but one had made good their escape. So assured of his innocence was Con Burley that he elected to remain behind. Since he was charged jointly with the 3 Ribbles on the murder indictment, his trial was laid over to the summer assizes. Burley's 3 co-defendants enjoyed their liberty for a brief time only. By the time the officials assembled in the partly completed new courthouse on a sweltering August day, all 4 were safely ensconced in their cells. Meanwhile, Edward Boswell and his congregation had not been idle. Land had been secured early in the year from the government, at the northwest corner of Redoubt and Dundas streets, and on this the frame of a church building had been erected by the congregation. The lot was substantial, 2.5 acres, and so was the church, the frame being 80 feet long by 40 in width. Beside the frame of the church was the graveyard, and at least one fresh grave, that of Lawrence Lorassen, who died on March 9 at the age of 70 years. Lorassen was a veteran of the American Revolutionary War, a United Empire loyalist and founder of one of London's oldest families. The tombstone erected by the survivors can be seen today in the cathedral grounds. The assizes offered the only entertainment available at this period to the people of the district, and soon accommodation in the village hotels was at a premium. Although the criminal docket was a heavy one, interest centered from the beginning on the Pomeroy murder case, perhaps because it involved the violent death of a peace officer, or more likely because of the circumstantial nature of the Crown's case. The Reverend James Jackson took a personal interest in the defense of the three members of the Ribble family. They were landowners and, possibly, Methodists. The reasoning of Jackson and other defenders of the Ribbles seems to have been that a verdict against them would cost the lives of three church-going taxpayers, while an unfavorable decision by the jurors against Burley would result in no hardship to anyone except, of course, Burley himself. The Ribbles were tried first. Before court assembled that August morning, everyone in town, including the potential juryman, had in his hands a printed document purporting to be the confession of Cornelius Alverson Burley to the Moor of Timothy Conklin Pomeroy. It was a very literate affair which blamed the whole unhappy matter upon Burley's sinful predilection for the joys of the dance. This, plus the fact that the production came from the press of the Wesleyan Advocate, points unmistakably to the Reverend James Jackson as the instigator of the project and the author of the confession and its precise timing. The issue was inevitable. The Ribbles were acquitted and Con Burley was sentenced to be hanged. The execution took place 3 days later in front of the courthouse. Con was hanged in the presence of 3,000 witnesses. The total population of the village at this time was less than 300. The spectators at this Roman holiday got more than their money's worth. It turned out to be a double feature. The parsimonious officials had provided an unsound rope which snapped as Burley went through the trap. While the half-choked victim staggered about among the crowd, exhorting them incoherently to repentance, someone nipped across the street to the general store operated by George Jervis Goodhue, a Connecticut Yankee who was a member of the Reverend M.R. Boswell's congregation, and purchased a new rope. Con went through the trap again while blue-smocked yeomen held up their children to witness the condemned man's last, grisly dance. Although the Burley confession intimated that Jackson was the spiritual advisor for the condemned man, it was the Reverend Edward J. Boswell who attended him at the scaffold and who also baptized him in the rites of the Church of England prior to his execution. The record, in the first register of St. Paul's Church, reads: Cornelius A. Burley, a condemned criminal aged as he supposed about 26 or 27, baptized 19th August 1830. The double hanging of Cornelius Burley did not end the day's entertainment. In accordance with custom, the body was turned over to the local medical men. The only cadavers available to practicing physicians and their students were those of paupers without relatives and executed criminals. The ensuing dissection of Burley's corpse was, like the execution, a public spectacle. Nor was even this the end of the humiliation to which poor, stupid Con's earthly clay was subjected. By chance there was a young student from Yale University in London that day. The young man's name was then unknown to fame, a later generation would know it as a household word. He was Orson Squires Fowler, who made the pseudoscience of phrenology the base of one of the largest personal fortunes in 19th-century North America. Fowler begged Burley's head of the medical fraternity. Receiving his boon, he lugged the grisly trophy off, stripped the skull of flesh and cured it. Later some reports say the same night he used the skull to demonstrate the various bumps and hollows which, according to him, illustrated the facets of unhappy Con's character. Fowler took the skull with him when he left London. Throughout his long public career it accompanied him wherever he went. In his thousands of public appearances before the rich and poor, the common people and the crowned heads of Europe, Burley's skull was his demonstration piece, his gimmick. The top of the skull had been neatly sawed off, so that a candle could be inserted. When the top was fitted on again, the light showed the varying thicknesses of the skull upon which Fowler's art or science depended. After having been viewed by more persons than the skull of any other baptized person in history, the head was returned to London during Fowler's last North American tour and deposited through some chance with the Harris family of Eldon House. The skull, minus the important sawn-off top, may be seen today at Eldon House, now an historic site operated by the London Public Library. By an interesting coincidence, the Harris property was purchased in October 1832, by John Harris from the Reverend Edward J. Boswell, who had baptized Cornelius Burley. That then is the story of the fourth member of the quartet of celebrated persons whom Edward Boswell baptized during the 3 years and 2 months that he served the mission of London. As the missionary ended his first full year of service, he had cause to be pleased with the accomplishments of himself and his congregation. He himself had been ordered priest at Montreal in July. He had secured land for a church, and the congregation had begun the erection of a house of worship. On it, his year-end report to the SPG was optimistic. I have only a schoolhouse in which to perform divine service, but I trust that as the frame of a church has been erected this summer, the inhabitants may be able to finish it next year. Plague, and while the flesh was yet between their teeth, ere it was chewed, the wrath of the Lord was kindled against the people, and the Lord smote the people with a very great plague. Numbers 11:33. Boswell's optimism in Bis church and congregation was in the result unjustified. For reasons now unknown, the huge frame of the uncompleted church at the corner of Dundas and Redoubt Streets remained unfinished and untenanted throughout the missionaries' stay in London. Compared with the previous year, 1831 was a quiet time. Little of interest occurred in the village or within the congregation. At the rectory, the only incident to break the even succession of entries of births, marriages, and deaths in the parish register was the priests occasionally running out of ink. Thus, for example, in the church register under date of November 1, 1831, under the record of the marriage of William Dan and Sarah Rollins, we see this notation by Boswell: "No ink in the house." Could not get the signatures of the parties, took notes of registry at the house. This ink shortage occurred 2 or 3 times, always at the first of the month. We are left to speculate whether this recurring situation was due to a supply problem in the remote frontier hamlet, or whether the missionaries' own meager stipend gave out at each month's end. Our curiosity must also remain unsatisfied about Boswell's place of residence. As mentioned in the last chapter, Boswell owned the property on which the Harris family later built their home, Eldon House, having purchased it from John Kent sometime in 1831. Whether the house Boswell refers to in the above notation was on this property or not, is not known. The schoolhouse continued to be the site of Sunday services. For some reason Boswell reapplied for its use to the bench of magistrates on April 15, 1831, and permission was granted. At the beginning of the new year, 1832, Boswell apparently decided to push ahead with the matter of the uncompleted church. An article from the London Sun, reprinted in the Courier of Upper Canada, reported in March that at the suggestion of the members of the congregation, the Rev. Mr. Boswell was induced to apply to the Lieutenant Governor in Council for permission to sell about 1/2 acre of the reserve, it being utterly unfit for a graveyard. The newspaper account adds that permission had been granted, and 8 building lots, each 30 by 80 feet, would be auctioned shortly at an anticipated price of £75 to £125 each. From another source we learn that Boswell's proposal had been endorsed by Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Talbot, doughty patriarch of the Talbot settlement. In a letter to the Land Committee of the Executive Council of Upper Canada dated February 20, 1832, the Colonel wrote, 2 half-acre lots were reserved in the village plot of London for a Protestant church and churchyard, viz., No. 21 for the church and No. 22 for the churchyard, both on the north side of Dundas Street. There has been a substantial frame erected for the church, but which is not covered in and consequently is daily receiving injury from the weather. Mr. Boswell is of opinion that such of the ground as the church does not occupy could be sold for a sufficient sum to finish the church, which certainly would be desirable. Once again the Anglicans of London seem to have been somewhat unfairly dealt with by the authorities. As the Sun stated, an apparently favourable answer had been received from the Land Committee, but on April 17 the decision was reversed and Boswell was told the government opposed the sale of the land and would agree only to authorise an exchange for better land. No such exchange was made and services continued to be held in the schoolhouse. While these quarters were probably adequate in the summer months, the building was miserably cold in the winter. A Presbyterian minister who later preached there noted in his diary, "I preached in the morning to about 30 persons from Matthew 4, 1-12. The depth of the snow was the reason, I suppose, why there were so few persons present. The schoolhouse is very cold and I shall not willingly preach in it again in winter." The quiet time was over. With the coming of the spring of 1832, the village of London and the British colony in which it served as an insignificant regional capital entered upon a severe period of testing. The sailing vessels began leaving the ports of the United Kingdom as soon as the ice broke up on the St. Lawrence River. Each bore its full, and often overfull, quota of emigrants bound for the free lands of Upper Canada. By early summer the tide was at full flow. There were tens of thousands of them. Immigration records show that no less than 92,000 arrived in Canada that year, most of them from the British Isles. The ships were rickety, overcrowded and under-provisioned. The immigrants were packed into their holds like cattle. Most of the vessels were little more than floating pigsties. Privacy was non-existent. Under these conditions, on voyages lasting from 4 to 8 weeks, the spread of contagious disease was inevitable. Unfortunately, the upsurge in immigration coincided with a particularly violent outbreak of Asiatic cholera in the United Kingdom. The epidemic originated in India in 1827 and in the ensuing years slowly made its way through Asia Minor and thence into Europe. The disease made a successful lodgment in the crowded and filthy slums of the larger English cities and spread with appalling speed and virulence. The mortality rate seems to have been higher in Europe and North America than in the homeland of the disease, probably because the people of the western lands had built up no resistance to its ravages. Few immigrant vessels arrived in Canada with a full quota of passengers. Death and burial of cholera victims on the high seas were an almost daily occurrence aboard the ships. On arrival in Canada, precautions were taken to prevent the spread of the disease, with some success at first. Gros Isle, the island of death in the St. Lawrence River, was the first stop for all vessels. Here overworked immigration officials endeavored to check the incidence of disease and to hold vessels in quarantine until a clear bill of health could be given. What happened was of course inevitable. A passenger carrying the disease escaped official surveillance and got into Quebec City. Within a week the epidemic was raging there and shortly spread to Montreal and thence westward into Upper Canada. By June 10 there were 55 cases at Quebec, of whom 45 died within a matter of hours. The Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, Sir John Colborne, took immediate action without waiting for the sanction of the legislature. Physicians were appointed to attend the victims and various buildings selected or built for the reception of sufferers. In the district of London, hospitals or pest houses were opened at Turkey Point, Port Burwell, Port Stanley, on the Longwoods Road in the township of Cardock, and in the village of London. In London, a private residence, built sometime in the mid-late 20s on the Hamilton Road by Fells Hubbard, was converted to use as a hospital. The building, some distance from the village limits, was owned in 1832 by Tillery Hubbard, a son of the builder, who had allowed it to fall into disrepair. The building was hastily refitted in 2 days, barely in time to receive the first victims of the epidemic. There is no record of the names of the poor immigrants treated here or of the place of burial of those who died. We know only that there were several deaths. None but the utterly destitute went there. District residents who caught the disease were treated in private homes. Many of the latter also died. The 2 or 3 local physicians, including Dr. Hiram Davis Lee, operator of one of the local hotels, were quickly overwhelmed by the volume of cases. In response to their plea for help, the government authorities at York sent Dr. John Patrick Donnelly, a former surgeon in the Royal Navy. Donnelly arrived in London on June 30. Exactly 1 month later he was buried in the graveyard beside the unfinished frame of St. Paul's Church, a victim of the disease he had fought so valiantly to check. Donnelly was a Roman Catholic. And a sad story is told about the unsuccessful search by his unnamed Negro attendant to find a priest to minister to the dying man. On receipt of the news of Dr. Donnelly's fatal illness, the government dispatched another Irish physician, Dr. George Moore, to the village. Moore continued to attend the cholera patients assisted by Dr. Elam Stimson until October 5, by which time the danger was past. Moore seems to have escaped the consequences of the disease, but Stimson lost his young wife and son, both of whom were buried near Dr. Donnelly. In the absence of complete records, it is difficult to assess the effect of the epidemic on the village. The most accurate account available is that pieced together by the late Dr. Edwin Seaborn in the March of Medicine in Western Ontario. From this and from other materials subsequently located, it would appear that the number of deaths resulting from the disease in the village was not less than 15 and may have been 2 or 3 times this figure. The effect of this number of deaths in a population of little more than 300 can only be imagined. By mid-August, many of the residents had fled the stricken town, taking refuge in the more healthy countryside. By the end of the month, the village was practically deserted except for the victims of the plague, the hard-working doctors, the male nurses, the grave diggers and the Reverend Edward Boswell. 0 Published by the Ryerson Press, 1944. Boswell himself left no record of his participation in the events of the epidemic, and no trace of his activities can be found in the parish register. He must have baptized some sufferers and buried others, but it was not a time for the keeping of meticulous records. From the reminiscences of early settlers, set down years later, one heroic story emerges concerning the missionary. It is said that during the height of the epidemic, when the disease was carrying off victims daily, Boswell stationed himself at Blackfriars Bridge on Redoubt Street, the main entrance to the village from the north, warning travellers against entering London. How long he maintained his vigil there we do not know. By September, the cholera had abated sufficiently to permit the holding of the fall assizes in the new courthouse, and the prospects of another public hanging were proving enough to overcome the fear of the plague. Thousands of district residents plucked up enough courage to go to London for the official taking off of Henry Sovereign. Sovereign, a farmer of Norfolk County, had once before escaped the gallows. In 1828 he had been sentenced to death for horse stealing, but the sentence had been remitted. However, while Canadian justice was becoming averse to the exercise of the death penalty in cases of larceny, it still took a decidedly dim view of homicide, particularly when committed on a wholesale scale. The crime for which Sovereign was ceremonially dispatched involved the brutal murder of his wife and 6 children. Unlike the case of Burley 2 years before, no sympathy whatever was displayed for the second victim of London's gallows. There seems to have been no doubt of Sovereign's guilt, and the trial did not take up much of the court's time. There is no record of the disposal of the condemned man's body. He was apparently attended at the scaffold not by Boswell but by the Reverend Alexander Mackintosh, missionary at St. Thomas. By the 1st of October life in the village had been restored to normal. On the 10th of the month Boswell officiated at a baptism and a wedding, his last official acts in London. Shortly thereafter he left the village for a new post in Montreal. The deed of bargain and sale of his property on Redoubt Street to John Harris bears the date of October 13. The instrument, as required by law, conveys the property as from the Reverend E. J. Boswell etux. This curt legal reference is the only record of any kind referring to Mrs. Boswell, with the exception of a notation in the parish register where Eliza Boswell is given as a witness at the marriage of David Knight and Lavina Cowperthwaite on April 5, 1832. The records of the Anglican Church of Canada give us a few sparse notes about the subsequent career of Edward Jukes Boswell. He later served in parishes at Carleton Place and Williamsburg. On the formation of the Diocese of Ontario he was appointed rector at Prescott, which charge he held until he retired in 1868. He died in Kingston, Ontario on August 26, 1879, almost exactly 50 years after his arrival in London. No streets, no monuments, no plaques or memorials mark the service given to the congregation of St. Paul's and the community of London by Edward Boswell. Nor are there any memorials to the victims of London's Great Plague or those who laboured in their behalf. The 5 fresh graves in the cemetery at the foot of Dundas Street to which one writer refers were soon forgotten, and the names of those interred there lost to record. One structure survives to connect the London of today with the terrifying epidemic of 1832. The Cholera Hospital on the Hamilton Road, although somewhat altered in the course of the years and recently damaged inside by fire, still stands. No. 435 Hamilton Road, being probably the oldest building within the limits of the modern city of London. Church and 8 Hen the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, they set the priests in their apparel with trumpets, and the Levites the sons of Asaph with cymbals, to praise the Lord, after the ordinance of David king of Israel. And they sang together by course in praising and giving thanks unto the Lord, because he is good, for his mercy endureth forever toward Israel. And all the people shouted with a great shout, when they praised the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. Ezra 3, 10-11. By the middle of November, 1832, life in the village had slid back into its accustomed groove. The first frosts had neutralized the noxious effluvia that had caused the cholera epidemic, and the first snows had mercifully hidden the unsightly garbage heaps that had promoted its spread. The population, reduced by dread of the cholera, and increased by the entertainment afforded by the sovereign hanging, had levelled out at approximately the former figure of some 300 households. A number of these households were Anglican. They now had no spiritual solace except what they could provide among themselves, and no shepherd to lead them. Meanwhile the snow drifted about the bare beams of Boswell's Folly, while moisture and cold went silently ahead with their work of destruction on the uncompleted church. The SPG had apparently lost some of its interest in the London mission. Perhaps one reason for this was the failure of the congregation even to provide a home for itself. After all, the people of St. Thomas, without the advantages possessed by London as district capital, had constructed a church. Within a few months of the arrival of their missionary in 1824. If there were special circumstances operating in London, they were not obvious to the members of the society, separated from the scene by an ocean and half a continent. A field that did excite the interest of the SPG, however, was the mass migration of settlers from the United Kingdom into the townships west of London the previous summer. This settlement, under distinguished patronage, involved more than 2,000 persons, many of them presumably with an established church background. The story of this settlement has been adequately and romantically told by one of its literate pioneers and requires no amplification here. Our present interest lies in the fact that Providence manipulated the intent of the SPG into answering the prayers of the London congregation as well. In August 1932, as poor, weary Boswell was maintaining his vigil at Blackfriars Bridge, a ship sailed from Dublin with a human cargo bound eventually for the Adelaide Township settlement. She was the Anne of Halifax and included in her passenger list men and women, boys and girls, destined to leave an imprint on the history of their to-be-adopted land. 3 of the families aboard were closely related by marriage: the Cronins, the Blakes, and the Broughes. It is with the Cronins that this history is directly concerned, and with one member of that family in particular, a young curate, a native of Kilkenny, Ireland, late assistant curate of the parish of Kilcamick, Liley, County Longford, christened Benjamin. The Reverend Benjamin Cronin was on his way to Adelaide Township, whether on his own or with the financial assistance of the SPG is not clear. After a long and difficult sea voyage, 6 weeks in the quarantine station at Grosse Isle in the St. Lawrence, there had been a death from cholera. Shortly after the vessel left harbour, additional arduous voyages on 2 different lake vessels on 2 different lakes, and a trying 30-mile ride over a bumpy corduroy road in an ox cart, Cronin and his family arrived at the village of London with the prospect of an additional land journey of 20 miles. Before reaching the Adelaide settlement, it was night and the roads were perilous even in the daytime. A decision was made to put up at a local hotel for the night. It was a decision which was to prove of prime importance to the congregation of St. Paul's and to the present Diocese of Huron. There were 4 in the Cronin family group: the curate, his wife Margaret, and the 2 children, Thomas, aged 6, and Jane, 3. They obtained accommodation at the Mansion House Hotel on Dundas Street, operated by Dr. Hiram Davis Lee, father of Graves Simcoe Lee, whose career was briefly outlined in Chapter 2. London's pioneer innkeeper, Peter MacGregor, had quit the business, and the village, heart broken by the shattering effect of the cholera epidemic on his family circle. The following day a delegation of London Anglicans waited on the curate. Word of his presence in the village had raised hopes which were dashed to the ground on learning of his destination. However, they easily prevailed upon him to preach to them in the schoolhouse. That Sunday in 1832 saw a regular procession of divines utilizing the school for church purposes. A Presbyterian preached in the morning, a Methodist at noon and an Anglican in the afternoon. The Presbyterian cleric, the Reverend William Proudfoot, was another recent arrival. In his meticulous diary, the Presbyterian cleric recorded the events of that day, preached to a full house on 1 Thess. 4:1. A Methodist, Mr. Jackson, occupied the place of worship in the middle of the day, and Mr. Cronin of the Episcopal Church at 4 p.m. Cronin's sermon apparently pleased the people. For the following day a second, and larger delegation waited on him in an effort to induce him to remain in London. The advantages of London were strongly advanced and the backwoods nature of the Adelaide settlement stressed. The young curate did not take long to arrive at his decision. A third Cronin was on the way. Verschoyle, born February 6, 1833, and comfortable quarters in a small but thriving village was an attractive proposition. He agreed to the congregation's request, it being understood he would provide care for the settlers of Adelaide as well. In this casual, apparently accidental way, an association began which was to have far-reaching consequences for the young curate himself and for the congregation whose spiritual welfare he undertook to supervise. The new missionary rapidly proved himself a man of enormous energy. Within the space of a few weeks he had not only fulfilled his promise to the Adelaide settlers by visiting them and making arrangements for future service, but he had also succeeded in making progress in the completion of the London Church. In fact, Cronin worked at such feverish speed it is difficult to establish an accurate chronology of events in the first year of his mission. First of all, a committee was organized to complete the church. 3 of its members were Lawrence Lorason, Edward Allen Talbot and Captain Richard Brown. On the instructions of this committee, Cronin visited the government offices in York. The expenses of the trip £7.10 provincial currency, equal to $30 American, were charged against the building account. The money was put to good use, permission being received to sell the lots on Dundas Street and to use the proceeds to complete the church in a better location. Further, a grant of land was made for the new site. This was the block bounded by North Street, now Queen's Avenue, Duke Street, now Dufferin Avenue, Clarence and Richmond Streets. The property contained in all 4 1/5 acres. A gossipy but probably not altogether accurate report of the missionary's visit to York is contained in the diary of the Reverend William Proudfoot under the date, March 7, 1833, Mr. John Talbot, schoolmaster, brother of Edward Allen Talbot, called. He told me that Mr. Cronin had returned from York, that the governor told Mr. Cronin that Upper Canada will probably be divided and that London will be its capital, that it is his intentions to send respectable loyalist emigrants who may apply to him to its district. That it is the intention of the government to raise up such a body of persons attached to the Constitution of Great Britain as may counteract the influence of Yankeeism so prevalent about St. Thomas and along the lake shore. Further, that the large Episcopal Church is to be finished this year from funds in the hands of the government. This last statement was certainly erroneous. The only assistance provided by the government was the land grant, the patent for which was not officially issued until January 18, 1836, when the parish was formally constituted by the Crown. Sometime during the winter of 1832-33 the frame built under Boswell's direction was moved from the corner of Dundas and Redoubt Streets to its new location. This was accomplished by a contractor, Lewis Hartman, who mounted the frame on sleighs and dragged it 3 city blocks with teams of oxen. His fee was £25, $100. Hartman also received the contract for the building of the new church. He began work about May 1, 1833, and submitted his last statement to the building committee on December 4 of the same year. The total cost of the church was £862.14. 5 LD. Provincial currency, $3,451. According to the accounts for the building to be seen among the Cronin papers at Huron College, London, Edward Allen Talbot undertook to clear the old site, £3.15s, John Jennings cleared the new site, £8 9s. 3 Ltd, William Hale provided the bricks for the foundation, £3, Dennis O'Brien hauled the materials, £10, William Haskett provided the labour, £36 5s, Charles Sifton dug the 18-foot well, £5 18s. 9d, and Robert Green supplied the pumps, £2 Is. 3d, Hartman's total bill, including the charge for moving the frame, was £675. This was quite a notable effort on the part of a small congregation. However, the costs were more than covered by the sale of the old site. Broken up into building lots, the property fetched a total of £877 4s. LL*D. $3,509. In addition to this amount, a stranger subscribed £1 $5 to the building fund. The purchasers of the lots, most of them village merchants, were George J. Goodhue, Dennis O'Brien, Mr. Lyman, Mr. Hunt, Mr. Schweiger, Messrs. Parks, Messrs. Robertson, and the Reverend Benjamin Cronin himself. Dennis O'Brien shortly afterwards built on his lot the first brick building in the village. There is considerable confusion in the records as to the date of the opening of the new church. From various references it would appear that the church was actually in use before the building program was completed and certainly prior to the official date of opening. For instance, on Thursday, February 14, 1833, the date officially set aside by the government for province-wide services of thanksgiving for the passing of the cholera epidemic, the Reverend William Proudfoot records in his diary, "Though this is the fast day or Thanksgiving Day, I saw no symptoms of its being kept. There was Sunday in the English church." Again on March 10 there is reference to the church as well as an unflattering reference to its parson. "On this morning I attended the Episcopal Church. Mr. Cronin preached a miserable but an orthodox sermon on the whole Christian armor. It beggared all description, but he seemed a serious man and sound in the faith so far as he knows anything about it." In addition, there is a notation in Cronin's report to the SPG on January 5, 1833, referring to the new church, commenting parenthetically that until within the last 3 months we met in the seminary, the schoolhouse. 3 days after this date a wedding was performed, possibly in the church, vividly recalled 69 years later by one of the participants, on the 8th day of January, 1833, "Your father married Freeman Talbot and Anne Eliza Clark, the first couple ever married by your father in Canada, as you will see BV the records today in St. Paul's Cathedral." From other references it is apparent that Cronin's congregation was still using the schoolhouse for services. Under date of August 3, 1833, Proudfoot complains that Cronin had deranged our system in regard to occupying the schoolhouse. Something over a month later insult was added to injury when the Presbyterian cleric showed up for his pointed turn at using the building to find the Church of England man preaching to his congregation. The Presbyterians proved to be bears for punishment. They all returned in the afternoon when Proudfoot delivered a lecture on the first 6 verses of the Epistle of St. Paul to the Galatians. The 6th verse seemed under the circumstances particularly pertinent. "I marvel that yet are so soon removed from him that called you into the grace of Christ unto another gospel." From these and other references it looks as if the new church, although unfinished, was occasionally used for special services, with regular services continuing to be held in the schoolhouse. By the end of the year the church interior was sufficiently in order to hold the Christmas communion there, at which time there were 30 communicants. The formal opening of St. Paul's, according to the Proudfoot diary, took place on September 14, 1834. No newspaper account survives, so we are left to speculate at the nature of the ceremonies attending the opening. Edward Allen Talbot's paper, The Sun, had succumbed to financial pressures sometime in 1833. Its place had been taken by the True Patriot, edited and published by Colonel George Washington Bustede. The Patriot flourished only a short time, and the colonel, who had once been secretary to the governor of the West Indies, returned to New York where he engaged in merchandising a patented soap guaranteed to cure most of the ills known to man. A few copies of the Patriot survive. None has yet been found of the Sun. In the absence of contemporary accounts, the interior and exterior appearance of the new St. Paul's Church has to be pieced together from a few scattered reminiscences and one picture painted in the 1840s in which the church appears to one side, rearing a rather extraordinary square tower above. The rail fences, stumps and outhouses which then cluttered downtown London. The church faced south on to North Street, the present Queen's Avenue. It was of wood construction like all the other buildings in the village with the sole exception of the courthouse. The tower or spire was too large in proportion to the church, as most observers pointed out. Considering the population of the village, it was a large church with a seating capacity of 400, and yet within a very few years Cronin was reporting that the average number in attendance on Sunday was 420. Such was the first church of St. Paul. From the erection of the frame in the summer of 1830 it had taken 4 years to build. Unlike most modern parish churches, it began its service to Tyre community free of all debt, thanks to the business acumen of the Reverend Benjamin Cronin. Cronin's position in London was regularized by Bishop Stewart on May 6, 1833, when he was appointed to the cure of souls in the town and township of London. At the same time the bishop wrote to Richard Brown, a member of the building committee and an acting church warden, urging the friends of the church to make such addition to Mr. Cronin's income as may enable him to dwell amongst them in that proper comfort which is his due. In the following February 9 members of the London Church, describing themselves as duly elected members of the select vestry of the township of London in the province of Upper Canada, agreed to serve as agents for the collection of funds towards the support of their parson. The document, to be found in the Cronin Papers at Huron College, London, is the earliest record of a formal church organization at St. Paul's. The 9 signatories, all persons of consequence in the tiny village, were Lawrence Laurasson, a prominent general merchant and the second of that name to be a member of the congregation, John Kent, a gentleman farmer and pioneer real estate developer, George Kennedy, of whom nothing seems to be known, John B. For Baptiste, a skin clerk of the peace for the District of London, Richard Brown, gentleman, William Haskett, farmer and one of the subcontractors for the building of the church, J. Parkinson, farmer, Hiram Davis Lee, physician and hotel proprietor, and John Hawkins, schoolmaster. And there came a fire out from before the Lord, and consumed upon the altar the burnt offering and the fat, which when all the people saw, they shouted, and fell on their faces. Leviticus 9:24. The tale-towered first church of St. Paul served its community for a few short months short of 10 years. For the church, its rector, its congregation, and its parish, these were years filled with excitement and high drama. The curtain raiser was the critical provincial election of 1836, in which Benjamin Cronin played an active role. 4 years' residence in Upper Canada had given him sufficient knowledge of the country, the people, and the political situation to place him in a position of some influence. That knowledge had been gained at first hand on the back roads and in the backwoods. In his report to Bishop Stewart in January 1835, Cronin listed the congregations to which he was ministering. His congregation in London, St. Paul's, consisted of some 200 persons, a second in London Township, St. John's, Arva, consisted of 150 people, and a third, also in the township, 11 miles north of London, consisted of 300 persons. In addition to serving these 3 parishes, Cronin interested himself actively in the work of the church throughout the area, becoming deeply involved in the formation and work of the Western Clerical Society, organized to promote the interests of the church in the western counties. His position in his adopted community was raised considerably in importance in 1836, when St. Paul's became one of 44 rectories established by the Crown on the recommendation of the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, Sir John Colborne. It was perhaps inevitable that the rector of St. Paul's should become implicated in the political issues which were shortly to erupt in armed revolt. The Church of England was so thoroughly involved in those issues that no parson of any spirit could remain aloof from them. And Cronin had spirit. Almost from the day of his arrival in Canada, Benjamin Cronin showed a personal and practical interest in the land dealings of his church. By the Canada Act of 1791, a reserve of land in each new township, equal to 1/7 of the land granted to individuals, had been set aside for the support of a Protestant clergy. From the beginning, the Church of England had assumed itself to be the object of this legislative benefice. The supporters of the other churches challenged the assumption. In the result, with the support of a largely Anglican and Tory ruling class, the lion's share of the clergy reserves went to the Church of England. By 1833 the Church of England had received 22,345 acres, the Kirk of Scotland, 1,160, and the Roman Catholic Church, 400 acres. The other churches, including the Methodists, numerically the strongest group, received nothing at all. This is not the place for a detailed study of Benjamin Cronin's land dealings in his own behalf and that of his church. Suffice it to say that he proved himself a shrewd businessman, and neither he nor his church suffered as a result. One of the principal objections to the clergy reserve grants was that the presence of these unimproved, uncleared lots impeded settlement and the building of roads. As immigration increased in the 1830s, so did the resentment against the reserves and their beneficiary. The Reform Party, under the leadership of William Lyon Mackenzie, fanned this resentment into open flame. It became finally an unabashed class struggle, the privileged, as represented by the Tories, their leaders, the so-called Family Compact, and their church versus the underprivileged individuals and churches. It has been said that if the Reform Party had won the election of 1836, there would have been no rebellion in Upper Canada. Whatever the truth of this statement, it is certain that the bitterness engendered by the tactics used by the Tories on that occasion was a contributing factor in precipitating the uprising. The little village of London was a particular storm centre in the election. With a population hovering around the 1,000 mark and a strongly entrenched little family compact of its own, it was set up as a separate riding in the hope it would provide a safe seat for the Tory nominee. Lieutenant Colonel Mahlon Burwell, a surveyor, an extensive landowner and a close associate of Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Talbot. The Reformers nominated John Scatcherd, a local farmer. The London Tories threw everything they had into the election, including Benjamin Cronin. The Reverend William Proudfoot, who had strong reform sympathies, records his attitude towards Cronin's activities in a curt diary entry under the date of June 23, 1836, Parson Cronin has been all over the township electioneering. Bah! The Tories did not have it all their own way. The Reformers showed surprising strength in the town and the surrounding area. Tempers mounted to fever heat as the day of the election, July 1, 1836, approached. The election itself was a disgrace to democratic institutions. No local newspaper files survive for the period, but there is sufficient other evidence to prove that the Tories won the election by methods which would today call for an immediate royal commission. As it was, the charges against the local Tories were of a sufficiently serious nature to warrant investigation by a select committee of the Tory-dominated Legislative Assembly. Several of the eyewitnesses of the events of that day place Benjamin Cronin and some of his leading parishioners in the thick of the fray. Robert Davis, a local farmer who later lost his life fighting for the reform cause, described the melee in these words: "If you had been in London at the last election, you would have seen a set of government tools called Orange men, running up and down the streets crying £5 for a Liberal, and if a man said a word contrary to their opinion he was knocked down. Many were knocked down in this way and others threatened, and all this in the presence of magistrates, Church of England ministers and judges, who made use of no means to prevent such outrages." Another admittedly biased eyewitness was Dr. Charles Duncombe, one of the members for Oxford County, and himself a leader of the rebellion of 1837. Duncombe, in a memorial addressed to the British government, claimed that on the day of the election, as he approached London, he met a reform candidate, Elias Moore, running for his life from Tory Orangemen, and that in London itself he found reformers being driven away from the polls by armed Tories. This, he said, was done in the presence of officers of the law and of the rector of the endowed Church of England parish. A more objective account by a visitor to London fails to identify any of the participants but characterises the affair as a gathering which for riot and drunkenness exceeded everything he had ever seen before. Most of the accounts coupled the name of the rector's warden, Lawrence Lorasson, with that of Cronin as one of the principals on that disgraceful day. Both were summoned to appear before the Select Committee and their evidence substantially agreed. The rector admitted that there had been violence but said he had often seen more fighting on the annual militia training day. This may well have been so, for Training Day, which occurred on June 4 each year, was notoriously an occasion for excess. Cronin's participation in the exciting events of Election Day was physically passive. His brother Thomas, on the other hand, was apparently not content with words. An old record reports that Edward Grattan, printer and publisher of the London Times, was held on bonds to give evidence against Thomas Cronin, indicted for assault. The results of the investigation by the Select Committee were inconclusive and unsatisfactory to both parties. Within a few months the extremists among the reformers had taken steps to implement their grievances by force of arms. Benjamin Cronin missed most of the excitement of that year of decision. In January he and the Reverend William Bettridge of Woodstock left for England to seek financial support for the church in Upper Canada. They went as official representatives and officers of the Western Clerical Society, of which Cronin was chairman and Bettridge, secretary. The Reverend Thomas Green, a young graduate, aged 27, of Trinity College, Dublin, took charge of St. Paul's during Cronin's absence. Green had been licensed by Bishop Stewart as a travelling missionary in the District of London in January, 1836. Green baptised 4 children on March 2, 1837, the first entries in St. Paul's register under his name. History was still repeating itself. As in the case of Boswell and Cronin before him, these entries record vital statistics relative to the Tipperary Irish settlers of London Township, brought to the New World in 1818 by Richard S. Talbot. Green was in the process of becoming a vital statistic himself. On September 22, 1837, while the village was vibrating like an overstrung violin with rumours of rebellion, the Reverend Thomas Green was married to an Irish girl, Kate Jane Killilly, by the Reverend Richard Blood, of the village of Delaware. Miss Killilly was the daughter of Hamilton H. Killilly, a transplanted Irish squire of the Regency variety. Killilly stalks through the history of the region like a small-screen version of the Prince Regent himself. Like George IV, he was sartorially colourful and his appetites were immense. On being charged on one occasion with the amount of drunkenness he permitted to the guests at his home Lanshaw, named for the family's estate in Ireland, he replied that he had never seen anyone drunk in his home. Being an honest man, he was forced to add an explanation of this extraordinary statement, that he himself was always the first under the table. Despite these amiable shortcomings, Hamilton Killilly gave much to his adopted country. As the first Minister of Public Works, he was responsible for developing the road system of the province, which, prior to the coming of the railways in the 1850s, was considered one of the best on the continent. Judging from the gap in the church records from September 22 to October 23, 1837, Killilly's new son-in-law and his bride enjoyed a short honeymoon before red ruin descended on the village. The full story of the rebellion of 1837 as it affected the village of London has yet to be written. The clandestine meetings, the secret passwords, the spy system, the hidden caches of ammunition, this is the material of romance, but this is not the place to tell the tale. With few exceptions, the congregation of St. Paul's remained loyal to the government of Upper Canada. To them the whole thing was ugly and dangerous, and the rebels were villains, fit only for hanging. The rebels were the romanticists, and they wrote their history on the run, and little of it The rebel movement in the District of London was large, powerful, and well supported, but the collapse of William Lyon Mackenzie's ill-trained force at Montgomery's Tavern in Toronto on December 7 left them isolated and at the mercy of swift-moving militia. Dr. Charles Duncombe, of St. Thomas, leader of the Western forces, decided against resistance and disbanded his troops at the village of Scotland, in Brant County, a few days later. Then the witch hunt began. By the end of the year, hundreds of suspected rebels had been arrested and confined in the London jail for varying periods, often without even the formal laying of charges. The prisoners came from all classes of the community. There were storekeepers and farmers and cattle drovers and ironmongers. John Talbot, son of Richard Talbot and a parishioner of St. Paul's, fled for his life to the United States with a price on his head, and his brother Edward Allen, the writer and editor, was arrested on suspicion. Suspicion was, in fact, the great enemy of the people. Rumors flew wildly in every direction. Typical of the state of mind of the inhabitants is the story told in later years by Colonel L. A. Norton, of California, himself deeply implicated in the rebellion. I learned that Colonel Maitland of the 32nd Infantry, then guarding London, was to march down to Delaware, while another command, with military stores, was to reach London next morning. I learned that after Colonel Maitland left, only 30 raw recruits would hold the village, and devised the plan of having my Uncle David assemble the Scotch on Westminster Street, make a night attack, release the prisoners and capture London. At this time my uncles were at the head of 400 patriots, but they could not do anything toward carrying out the plans. The village was in a fever. Scouts were sent out but were afraid to go out of sight of the settlement. They would retire to some secluded place, and ride their horses until they would get them in a perfect foam, then come rushing in and report the rebels surrounding all sides of the Union. Another would come in and report them nearer. At last they got them within 3 miles of the town, when Huey, or Howie, the turnkey, came in the room where the prisoners were, saying I would give $100 for an axe to cut down the bridge. The rebels had taken or hidden all the axes. People were hastily packing up and leaving. This, like all the other alarms, was false, but the people were ready to believe them all. Their fears were somewhat alleviated by the arrival of a battalion of the 32nd Regiment of Foot under the command of Lieutenant Colonel John Maitland, mentioned in the excerpt above. Maitland, a son of the Earl of Lauderdale, was a half-mad little martinet who exercised the brutal regulations of the British Army of that period with savage satisfaction. On one occasion, dissatisfied with the manner in which lashes were being applied to the back of an offending private, he snatched the whip from the hands of the person administering the punishment and completed the job his own way. The man died. On another occasion, carrying out the full prescribed penalty, he sentenced a man who had deserted his post to 50 lashes, branding with the letter D on both palms, and transportation to the penal colony of Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania, for life. This was London's protector, and London had soon had enough of him. When he died, quite suddenly, in 1839, he was given the largest and most impressive funeral the village had ever seen, and the happiest. He was buried on the grounds of St. Paul's, but the location of the grave and the stone that was supposed to have marked it has been lost. For nearly 2 years following the collapse of the Mackenzie revolt, the people of London lived in a state of almost hourly panic. The leaders of the rebellion, most of whom escaped to the United States, organized a ragtag army of unemployed young Americans who, as self-styled patriots, terrorized the border communities of Upper Canada from Windsor to Prescott. Throughout 1838 they made several raids, all unsuccessful. The last attack in the western counties came on December 4, when a band of more than 100 patriots crossed the Detroit River to Windsor. In a short but savage encounter with the Canadian militia, the invaders suffered heavy casualties, a number being killed and wounded, and 44 taken prisoner. The prisoners were hauled to London and lodged in the already overcrowded jail. In a swift trial by court-martial, 43 of the 44 were found guilty and sentenced to death. 6 men were actually hanged in the courthouse square during the early part of January. An additional 16 were transported to Van Diemen's Land and the rest were deported to the United States. Cronin family tradition records that the rector of St. Paul's attended the 6 condemned men at the gallows. It is said he found the experience harrowing and felt that the sentences were unduly harsh. The Reverend Thomas Green, Cronin's erstwhile surrogate, was apparently of a less forgiving nature. About this time he wrote a letter to the editor of the London, Canada, Times, roundly condemning the Protestant churches for adding fuel to the fire of rebellion, and expressing belief that not one member of the Church of England was known to have participated in the revolt. His letter concluded with this extraordinarily partisan statement: "We see who are the disaffected, and who are the contented. How desirable then by every means to increase the number of the latter and draw off from the ranks of the former. In a word, how all important is it for the promotion of good order and peace in Upper Canada to look well to the provision existing for the sound religious instruction of the people there in the principles of the Church of England. Can it be doubted that the efficiency of the Church in Canada is important towards quelling existing disorders and promoting a healthier tone of society, harmony among the inhabitants and obedience to the laws? In the disaffected parts of Upper Canada it is evident it must be available to this end." The letter was reprinted in the Church, the official organ of the Church of England in Upper Canada, and precipitated an avalanche of criticism from the other church groups in the province. One aftermath of the rebellion permanently affected the life of the village of London. That was the establishment of a garrison of British troops. Temporary accommodation in a number of downtown buildings was soon exchanged for a permanent barracks somewhat to the north, on land now occupied by Victoria Park. The complex of buildings, some of log, some framed structures, took some years to erect. The contractor was a prominent member of St. Paul's Church, Edward Matthews. The contract, by far the largest granted in London up to this time, involved more than £100,000. Like many another before him, and since, Matthews found financing such a project eventually an intolerable burden. He later became inextricably enmeshed in land speculation and died a suicide on June 22, 1851. Memorial tablets to the memory of his young wife and 3 of his children are to be seen in the north transept of the cathedral. There is no memorial to the contractor himself. As soon as the intention of the British government to make London a garrison town became known, Cronin applied for the chaplaincy of the barracks, which he obtained. Church parades became a regular and colourful addition to the life of St. Paul's. The presence of the military also contributed handsomely to the coffers of the church. The entry in the Preacher's Book for June 9, 1839, for instance, records a civilian collection of 12s. 60, while £3.15 IVID was collected from the military. With the passing of the rebellion and its attendant excitement, life in London and at St. Paul's settled down into more normal patterns. The church, which had seemed more than adequate for the needs of its congregation in 1834, was beginning to be overcrowded 6 years later. Average attendance seems to have hovered near the 400 mark, with up to 85 receiving the sacrament at the infrequent communion services, normally 4 in a year. The town was growing. In January, it achieved the status of a police village. At the first municipal election, George Jervis Goodhue, a member of the congregation of St. Paul's, became president of the village board. Goodhue, a tall Connecticut Yankee with cold blue eyes, was London's first merchant. He operated his business with such cool efficiency that, in the year of his election to chief office, he retired from merchandising and entered the even more lucrative field of land speculation. By his death in 1870 he had put together a personal fortune in excess of $1 million. It is of incidental interest to note that of the 7 presidents who headed the board during London's village days, 6 were members of St. Paul's congregation. In addition to Goodhue they were, James Givens, a leading barrister, president in 1841, Edward Matthews, the unhappy contractor, 1842–43, John Bockwell, a pioneer brewer who established in 1828 what later became the Brewery of John Labatt, Limited, President in 1845, T. W. Shepard, 1846, and Dr. Hiram Davis Lee, physician and hotel keeper, President in 1847. James Givens and T. W. Shepard led relatively quiet lives. The same could not be said for the other Anglican presidents of the village board. Goodhue's single-minded financial career made him one of the most disliked public figures in Ontario. The sad story of Edward Matthews has already been told. Dr. Lee, in addition to being the father of a brilliant actor, Graves Simcoe Lee, briefly mentioned in Chapter 2, was a notable village character in his own right. In this day of medical specialization, Lee's dual career may seem faintly comic, but in the early days of settlement in Upper Canada, many professional men were obliged to double in brass to keep body and soul together. Doctors were all too often paid in produce, if at all, while no one expected a tavern keeper to accept anything but cash. Even so, there were occasional comments about Lee's economically split personality. A piece of very bad satirical verse on the brief hotel career of one Peter McCann, which appeared in the London, Canada, Times of January 23, 1846, makes a bleak reference to Dr. Lee. He, McCann, had 5 beds and a bunk, but says Lee's he will get drunk. You cannot tell just how he feels, for he buys no more Lee's pills. The good doctor, last presiding officer of the village board, died before his term of office. W7 as up, a victim of the ship's fever epidemic of 1847. John Bockwell W., as a merry rogue who frequently overindulged in the product of his own brewery, as the minutes of the village board meeting of October 23, 1843, plainly testify. John Bockwell, Esq. Having attended the board in a state of intoxication, ordered that the constable do remove him, he having done everything in his power to impede the proceedings of the board. John Bockwell, Esq., one of the members of the board, having broken the windows of the office, or instigated the same to be done, ordered that the board adjourn till tomorrow morning. As a result of Bockwell's merry pranks, the village clerk, William King Cornish, threatened to resign. Considering the fact that Cornish, in addition to siring that extraordinary politician, Frank Cornish, was given to other practical jokes as well, one of which cost him his lawyer's gown, the behavior of the brewer must have been extravagantly outrageous on this occasion to warrant such action. In these conformist days few villages can boast more than 1 or 2 characters. London in the 1840s could have supplied 100, and of the 100 at least 75 would have been Anglicans. The Church could use them today. Mention has already been made of the overcrowding at St. Paul's, due largely to the addition of the military to the regular congregation. Steps were taken in the latter part of 1843 to alleviate this situation by the addition of galleries. Donations were sought for this purpose, and the sum of £50 provincial currency, $200, had been raised by the beginning of the Lenten season of 1844. The church faced a reasonably prosperous future even if it had no linens, as Cronin's report for 1840 complains. Apparently some lady of the congregation supplied a cloth for the communion table and a napkin to cover the elements each time the sacrament was administered. The building was paid for. The 400 acres of glebe land belonging to the parish was under cultivation and rented, and the congregation was affluent enough to provide a special yearly collection of £4 to £5 for the alleviation of the suffering of the poor within the parish limits. From the post-rebellion period onwards through the long history of St. Paul's, a concern for the distressed within its reach has been a constant feature of the Church's witness, culminating with the unique core area project inaugurated in the fall of 1963. The musical life of the church had not been overlooked. Early in 1844 an organ was installed. The instrument was the unaided work of George Pringle, a village cabinet maker. There is no way of telling how good the organ was. It was heard only on 2 or 3 public occasions, and those who heard left no record of its excellence or otherwise. The hand of God fell upon St. Paul's on the first day of Lent, 1844. On February 21, Ash Wednesday, the church caught fire and burned to the ground. No complete newspaper files for the period survive, so it is impossible to relate exactly what happened, although from one or two references it would appear the burning church ignited some other buildings to the south of it. The collapse of the ungainly spire, the whine of the flames through the pipes of George Pringle's organ, the crumbling into ashes of the frame laboriously erected under Edward Boswell's direction in the summer of 1830 all went unrecorded. All that was remembered, to be set down many years later, was the mighty fall of the brand new bell, only recently installed in the steeple. With a vast, complaining, musical crash, it fell to the ground and its fall was heard and lamented within the square mile of the parish bounds. Note: the rebellion documents quoted in this chapter are from Western Ontario and the American Frontier by Fred Landon, The Ryerson Press, Toronto, 1941. Chapter 6 Phoenix The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord hath anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek. To appoint unto them that mourn in Zion, to give unto them beauty for ashes, the oil of joy for mourning, the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness, that they might be called trees of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he might be glorified. Isaiah 61, 1-3 The congregation of St. Paul's was shocked but not demoralized by the tragedy that had struck the church. There was no service on Sunday, February 25, but by the following Sunday arrangements had been made for the use of the Mechanics' Institute building on the courthouse square. The institute, a small neat building with a classical portico, had been built 3 years previously to serve the community as a library and reading room, with facilities also for lectures and public meetings. Mechanics' institutes were being founded in all the larger towns in the province in the 1840s. They were based on an English model and represented a 19th-century adult education movement. The London Mechanics' Institute eventually developed into a public library system. The auditorium of the institute must have been of reasonable size, for at the Easter Communion on April 7, Benjamin Cronin administered the sacrament to 85 communicants, who would not of course represent the total congregation present on that occasion. On the Friday following the first service in the institute, that is on March 8, 1844, a special meeting of the vestry of St. Paul's was held at William Bockwill's tavern to lay plans for the building of a new church. The first resolution outlined the intended dimensions and general form of the new building, 49. Moved by John Wilson Esquire. And seconded by the Hon. G.O.J. Goodhue, that St. Paul's Church about to be built on the site of the one lately consumed shall be brick on a stone foundation, about 60 feet by 90 inside the walls, varying not more than 10 feet either way in the discretion of the building committee to be hereafter appointed for the erection of said church, which shall be Gothic in its architecture. The second resolution named the building committee, consisting of the following gentlemen: John Wilson, C.S. Gzowski, Francis Pope, Edward Matthews, William W. Street, Geo. J. Goodhue, George Thomas, William Till, Thomas Worthington and Samuel Peters. Here once again we see associated with St. Paul's the names of community leaders, men whose peculiar talents and often extraordinary careers demonstrate vividly the type of brilliant nonconformist who laid Canada's urban foundations and whose departure from the Canadian scene left our cities so sadly depleted of individualism. Edward Matthews and George J. Goodhue we already know about. William Warren Street was auditor of the District of London and manager of the Gore Bank on Redoubt Street. William Till was a cabinet maker, Thomas Worthington a plumber, and Francis Pope a general contractor. Judging from his copper-plate handwriting, George Thomas, secretary of the committee, was probably a professional man of some kind. Samuel Peters, a pioneer surveyor and distiller prominent in the Masonic order, built a large home to the west of the original town site overlooking London. The village that grew up in the vicinity was known as Petersville in his honor and retained that name until annexed to the city in 1896. The Peters home still stands and is occupied by Samuel Peters' granddaughter, Mrs. James P. Dunn. W.Ho is a member of the Cathedral congregation. Kazimir Stanislaus Gzowski, later Sir Kazimir, was born in St. Petersburg, Russia. In 1813, a son of Stanislaw, Count Gzowski, a Polish officer in the Imperial Russian Guard. Gzowski studied military engineering in Poland and entered the Russian army. However, in November 1830, he took part in an abortive Polish uprising against the Tsar and was wounded, captured, imprisoned, and later exiled. He arrived in New York City in 1833 and after 8 years there removed to Upper Canada, settling in London. He became chief engineer of the Provincial Department of Public Works under his fellow townsman, Hamilton H. Killeley. In 1853 he organized the firm of Gzowski and Company, which secured the contract for the building of the Grand Trunk Railway from Toronto to Sarnia. A later and more famous achievement of the company was the building of the International Bridge at Niagara Falls in 1871 to 1873. Gzowski was knighted by Queen Victoria in 1890 and died in Toronto in 1898. Even in such illustrious company, the career of John Wilson, chairman of the building committee for the new St. Paul's, must be adjudged extraordinary. Wilson, a pioneer London lawyer of Scottish birth, was the surviving participant of the last fatal duel to be fought in Canada. In June 1833, at dawn on the banks of the River Tay, near Perth, Lipper, Canada, he met a fellow law student, Robert Lyon, and, in a double exchange of shots, fatally wounded his opponent. At the subsequent trial in Brockville, Wilson defended himself and won an acquittal. This terse review scarcely does credit to an incident heavily overlaid with Victorian romanticism. The cause of the dispute between the two friends was the honourable name of a young lady, whom Wilson later married. There was even a villain in the piece, rejoicing in the richly evil name of Leliaver. The victorious duellist came to London in 1834, where he rapidly established an outstanding reputation as a jurist, politician, and philanthropist. Lie first entered politics in 1847, winning the London riding as a Reform candidate. A derogatory remark made in Parliament about the Irish caused him to lose his seat in 1851 to a fellow member of St. Paul's, Thomas C. Dixon, a Tory hatter. Honest John Wilson, one of the most popular politicians ever to seek office in London, was in and out of the parliamentary scene until 1857, when he withdrew his name from candidacy. He was elevated to the bench in 1863, serving as a judge until his death in 1869. These then were the men who assumed the responsibility for building the new St. Paul's Church. Before Easter, 1844, they had accepted a plan prepared by William Thomas, a Toronto architect. Thomas was a native of Stroud, Gloucestershire, England, where he was born in 1800. After practicing as an architect at Leamington, where he designed Lansdowne Crescent and Circus, he emigrated to Canada and settled in Toronto, where he designed both St. Michael's Roman Catholic Cathedral and the jail. The late Reverend Dr. A.H. Crowfoot, biographer of Benjamin Cronin, drew attention to the similarity between the tower Thomas designed for St. Paul's, London, and the tower that Sir Charles Barry, architect of the British Houses of Parliament, designed for St. Peter's, Brighton, and suggested that William Thomas may have been a pupil of the great Englishman. Dr. Crowfoot also is authority for the statement that the stone used in the building of the Canadian church was from the same quarries on Portland Bill as the stone used by Christopher Wren in the erection of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, England. William Thomas's plan for St. Paul's called for a building with inside dimensions of 59 feet in width and 85 feet in length. There were no transepts, and the chancel was to be a half octagon of 31 feet in breadth and 15 feet 6 inches in depth. The tower was to be built of sufficient size and strength to receive a peal of 6 bells. The estimated cost of the structure was approximately £4,000, $16,000. In the result, the figure was closer to £7,000. Partially offsetting this large outlay was the insurance carried on the former building. This, according to the treasurer's accounts, amounted to £1,000, the proceeds of 2 policies, one for £800, carried by the Alliance Office, the second, for £200, by the Buffalo Company. Unfortunately for George Pringle, the talented cabinet maker, the insurance policies did not cover his laboriously handmade organ. Pringle applied to the vestry of St. Paul's for compensation for the loss of the instrument. The members of the vestry rather brutally declined to take any responsibility for a piece of equipment which they had neither commissioned nor agreed to purchase. Pringle apparently refused to give up his claim, and after 5 years of internal haggling, someone gave authority to the treasurer to settle the amount, in October 1849, with a payment of £17.10. The building committee moved ahead swiftly with its plans, and the laying of the cornerstone took place on the feast of the Nativity of St. John the Baptist, June 24, 1844. The Right Reverend John Strachan, Lord Bishop of Toronto, in whose diocese the church was situated, came to London especially for the occasion, which he later reported to the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge, in England, was quite a holy day in the town. The bishop's description of the mood of the community is fully warranted by the report of the event, which appeared originally in the London Inquirer and later reprinted in the Church of July 5. The account reads, in part, "We are always glad to mark the progress of improvement, and we are glad to record an event that, while it is likely to contribute to the architectural beauty of our town, will in moral point of view, be attended with more signal results. We allude to the erection of a new Episcopal church on the site where the old one stood. The laying of the foundation stone of this building took place on Monday last, with Masonic honors, and we will venture to say a more imposing and interesting display has never been witnessed in our town. The intended ceremony having been duly announced, crowds from the surrounding country met to witness it. And accordingly at an early hour our streets were thronged with anxious spectators, and presented a gay and animated aspect. The proceedings were well and judiciously arranged, and luckily the favourable state of the weather gave everyone an opportunity of enjoying the occasion. The Lord Bishop of Toronto came to London expressly for the purpose of affording his assistance and sanction, and all classes and denominations joined in a truly Christian spirit to do honour to the occasion. Never have we seen a more numerous and respectable procession in this town, and never has any public ceremony passed off with greater eclat. William Niles, one of the founders of Freemasonry in London, was marshal of the day. The procession assembled at the Middlesex County Courthouse, where a service was conducted by the Reverend Benjamin Cronin. The procession then paraded through the streets of the town to the site of the new church. The parade order was as follows: W. Thomas, the architect, a Union Jack, the town band, drums and fifes of the 23rd Royal Welsh Fusiliers, Tyler of Lodge No. 209, under whose auspices the stone was being laid, the Bishop of Toronto, supported on the right by Wilson Mills, chaplain of St. John's Lodge, and on the left by Rev. Benjamin Cronin, rector of the church. Clergy followed in their robes, and then a Masonic banner, stewards, the master, and members of St. John's Lodge, 2 by 2. After the lodge members went the Sheriff of the London District, the Judge of the London District Court, the Clerk of the Peace, the members of the bar in their robes, the church wardens, the President and members of the Mechanics' Institute of London, with their flag, the President and members of St. George's Society of St. Thomas, with their banners, the President and members of St. George's Society of London, also with their banners, as well as the members of both St. Andrews and St. Patrick's Societies of London with their banners. The end of the procession was brought up by citizens of the town of London and neighbourhood. Just what citizens were in the parade is not said. In this order the procession moved to St. Paul's churchyard, where, in the presence of several thousand spectators, the laying of the foundation stone took place. Bishop Strachan presided, and Samuel Peters, worshipful master of St. John's Lodge No. 209, wielded the silver trowel, repeating the ancient words: "In the faith of Jesus Christ we lay this foundation stone in the name of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost. Amen." The trowel used on this occasion is today the property of Samuel Peters' granddaughter, Mrs. James P. Dunn, of Grosvenor Lodge. According to the Inquirer account, the amateur band of London deserved much credit for the manner in which they acquitted themselves on the occasion, and the inspiring anthems sung added much to the harmony and solemnity. 2 parchment inscriptions, beautifully drawn and printed by Mr. Robert M. Moore, surveyor and draftsman, of this town along with other things, were deposited in the stone. The first was a Masonic inscription, St. John's Lodge. No. 209, held at London, CW, under the sanction of the Grand Lodge of Ireland. This cornerstone was laid on Monday, the 24th of June, 1844, and of masonry 5844. With Masonic honors, being the anniversary of St. John the Baptist. Samuel Peters, Worshipful Master, Pro Tem, acting on behalf of Hugh Falconer, W.M. A list of the officers of the year followed. The second parchment gave the year and also the year of the reign of Queen Victoria along with all her titles. Then followed the names of the Governor-General, the Bishop, the Rector, and the 2 wardens, Lawrence Lorasson, MPP, and William W. Street. The architect's name, William Thomas, completed the list. The inscription concluded with some information regarding the previous church. This church was erected upon the site of one built of wood in 1833 and destroyed by fire on Ash Wednesday, February 21, 1844. In addition to the parchments, the stone contained silver coins, numbers of the church newspaper, the Ecclesiastical Gazette, the Inquirer, and the Patriot, portraits of the Queen, the Governor-General, the Chief Justice and Colonel Talbot. Why a prize list of Upper Canada College was also included is not explained. The evening ended up with a Masonic banquet at which, in the custom of the day, endless toasts were proposed and responded to with increasing fluency and decreasing coherency. Once the celebration was over, the work of letting tenders for the building proceeded with redoubled energy. At a meeting of the building committee on July 18 the following tenders were accepted: for the stone work, Henry Simpson, of Toronto, £636, bricklaying and plastering, Buckle and Robinson, London, £675, plumbing and glazing, Thomas Worthington, London, £132 10s, painting J. Bonser and Thomas Fletcher, both of London, £100. The carpentry and joiner's work, the largest contract, was let to Messrs. Pope and Till of London, after some haggling, at £1,050. The total amount of the contracts was £2,593 10s. The cautious Mr. Goodhue raised a formal objection to proceeding with the building without having sufficient funds in hand, as he considers that the committee incurs personal liability. The committee's enthusiasm was not to be damped by the financier's cold water, and within a few days the workmen moved on to the site. It is a matter of cathedral legend that most of the bricks used in the building were actually formed and baked right on the site, there being a deposit of brick clay available. Meanwhile, a financial campaign for the necessary funds was being carried on among the friends of the church in the western parts of the huge Diocese of Toronto. The list of subscribers reads like an Upper Canadian who's who. 1. Of the most interesting names to be found is that of Richard Gildermaster, an exiled Belgian nobleman whose full title was the Baron de Toul, de Sirusterken de Isendum. He was a director of the Canada Land Company and founder of the village of Bayfield on Lake Huron, built on a circular plan. Although the list of subscribers was long, the amounts in each case were not large, and the total amount of money available was far short of what was required. The rector's warden, Lawrence Lorasson, once a business partner of George J. Goodhue, personally guaranteed payment to the contractors so that the work could continue. Sunday services continued to be held in the Mechanics' Institute. It was there, on Sunday, April 13, 1845, that the most dramatic incident in the history of the congregation of St. Paul's occurred. It was the service of Matins. There was a large congregation among whom was a distinguished visitor to London, the Honourable John Beverley Robinson, Chief Justice of the province. The Justice was staying at the Robinson Hall Hotel, a frame building on the corner of Redoubt and Dundas Streets, just across Redoubt Street from the courthouse and the Mechanics Institute. The hotel had been built by Peter MacGregor, London's first inhabitant, in 1832, and later sold to Dr. Hiram Davis Lee. The officiant, the Reverend Benjamin Cronin, gave out the psalm for the day. It was the 68th. The rector read the first verse, "Let God arise, let his enemies be scattered, let them also that hate him flee before him." The people, led by the Chief Justice, responded, "As smoke is driven away, so drive them away, as wax melteth before the fire, so let the wicked perish at the presence of God. But let the righteous be glad." The rector began. "Fire!" cried a voice outside on the street. An instant's pause, and the cry was echoed by other voices. The congregation was immobilized by fear for a moment, then an uneasy movement began towards the single exit. The auditorium was on the second floor of the institute. A narrow staircase led to the ground floor. Panic was in the air. Had it been allowed its head, a stampede might well have resulted, with a heavy loss of life. The rector took in the situation immediately, and in a loud voice continued the reading. "Let them rejoice before God, yea, let them exceedingly rejoice." Only the Chief Justice responded, in a clear, loud voice, "Sing unto God, sing praises to his name." On they went, rector and justice alternately reading the verses. Hardened by this display of self-control, the congregation withdrew in a quiet and orderly manner. When they were all out, Cronin and Robinson joined them in the courthouse square. The Robinson Hall Hotel was already doomed, and the fire was beginning to spread to adjacent buildings. At great personal risk, the Chief Justice ran inside the blazing building and retrieved his belongings. The local volunteer fire company was on hand with its single piece of equipment, a large reel of fire hose with a hand pump, donated to the village by George J. Goodhue. The machine was really nothing more than a big garden sprinkler. The pump was brought up close to the building and the company began to squirt water on the blaze. Within a very few moments the intense heat drove the firemen back, leaving their machine, which was soon consumed by the flames. From that moment on, the villagers had nothing to fight the flames with but leather fire buckets. It was soon apparent that the fire was completely out of control and all efforts at checking it were given up. Meanwhile Cronin, as chaplain for the garrison, had enlisted the services of some of the British Army units. Under his direction a squad of men from the Royal Artillery Barracks were kept busy all day removing furniture and personal belongings from doomed buildings and piling it in the open street, where it was guarded from looters by the men of the 2nd Royal Regiment of Foot. So rapidly and fiercely did the flames spread that more than one pile of furniture was gobbled up by the flames as soon as it had been removed to a place of apparent safety. By mid-afternoon the entire village seemed doomed. Virtually every building south of Dundas Street was on fire and the northern half of the town was being threatened by wind-borne blazing timbers. Fortunately the wind came around to the north, thus confining the ravages of the fire to the block in which it began and the neighbouring blocks to the south. By nightfall the main business section of London consisted of great piles of ashes. Everything within the district bounded by Redoubt, Dundas, and Talbot Streets and the south branch of the Thames River had been destroyed. Some 300 stores, houses, churches, banks, hotels, and other buildings were swept away. The following day the sufferers from the fire had good cause to thank Benjamin Cronin for obtaining the services of the infantrymen. One account says that a great number of would-be plunderers swarmed to the site from other parts of the village and the surrounding territory, hoping for a looters' field day among the ruins, but were held at bay by the fixed bayonets of the redcoats. Apparently the intending looters were not the only people hoping to benefit from the fire. A few Londoners endeavoured to raise funds for themselves in Toronto, representing themselves as principal sufferers in the disaster. Some were unwise enough to approach Bishop Strachan. He at once wrote to Benjamin Cronin suggesting that he call a public meeting of the best known and respectable of your inhabitants to set up a proper campaign for funds. The proposal was swiftly acted upon and soon donations were pouring into the stricken community from cities and towns all over Canada, from the United States and Great Britain, for the story of the fire had received widespread publicity. Estimates of the damage caused by London's Great Fire ranged as high as £300,000. No final accounting of the relief fund has been found, but by the summer of 1845 it had exceeded £100,000. The village board of police, determined there should be no repetition of the tragedy, immediately passed a bylaw prohibiting the erection of any more frame buildings within the village limits, in spite of the active and heroic role played by the rector of St. Paul's in the London disaster. Only one reference to the fire can be found in the cathedral records. This is in the preacher's book under date of April 13, 1845, where the notation occurs, "No collection Great Fire." Of much greater interest to the meeting of the vestry held on July 2 was the crowded state of the churchyard. From the time the first church was opened in 1834, the grounds surrounding St. Paul's had served the community as a general Protestant burial ground. Roman Catholics were interred across the street, in the grounds of St. Mary's Church, Maple, and Richmond Streets. The Roman Catholic Church was opened in the same year at St. Paul's, and its churchyard extended southward, taking in the property presently occupied by the Grand Theatre, home of the famous London Little Theatre. By 1845 St. Paul's churchyard was proving inadequate to the needs of a growing community. The vestry accordingly agreed that, beginning on September 1, 1845, none but members of the Church of England will be interred in the said burial ground. A committee was named to look into the matter of beautifying the grounds and also to make inquiries respecting the purchase of a site for a cemetery convenient to the town of London. The work of this committee led St. Paul's into the cemetery business and the eventual establishment of Woodland Cemetery. By the first of the new year, St. Paul's was rapidly nearing completion. The official opening took place on Ash Wednesday, February 25, 1846, just 2 years to the day after the burning of the first church. The event was well and thoroughly publicized in advance in the columns of the London Times, whose editor and publisher, Captain Joseph Cowley, formerly an officer of the Household Guards in the reign of King George IV, was a member of St. Paul's congregation. In the issue of February 20, the Times gave a rundown of the events planned for the day, ending with an evening concert of which the newspaper said, "As the proceeds are intended to create a fund for the purchase of an organ to celebrate the praises of the great Jehovah, we trust no secular or sectional views will prevent the attendance of our friends." On the day itself the church was jammed long before 11 o'clock, the hour appointed for the service to begin. The pews, intended to seat 1,000 persons, proved inadequate to accommodate the numbers who sought admission. It was estimated that 1,400 people were packed inside the walls, while several hundred others were unable to get in. The prayers were read by the Reverend Charles C. Brough, rector of Cronan's Old London Township parish of St. John's, and the lessons by the Reverend Francis Evans. Assisting at the Eucharist were the Reverends Henry Revell, Thomas B. Reed, Richard Flood, Mark Burnham, H. C. Cooper, James Mockridge, John Gunn, F. Sandys, and the Reverend M.R. Hobson. The rector delivered an eloquent and appropriate sermon in which a decided emphasis was placed upon the financial aspects of the structure. According to the Times, he urged the obligations Christians are under to give of their means to erect suitable temples dedicated to their worship of God, and as the design is promotion of His honor and the highest interests of man, so in general appearance, style, and degree of embellishment, they should surpass rather than fall below the standard of other public edifices, and surely it is unbecoming to erect them on that meagre and mere utilitarian principle which looks for nothing more in a church than the enclosing of a given space at the lowest possible cost. A church did not have to fall on the congregation, they took the hint. The crowded state of the building somewhat impeded the taking of the collection, but £45 was realized. The Times account of the opening ends with a richly opulent if not fruity paean to the builders, the congregation of St. Paul's, substantial in its materials, correct in design and architecture, embellished suitably to its style and character, and yet neither profuse nor extravagant in its ornaments, the present new church reflects much praise upon the spirit and Christian liberality of the Churchmen of London. May it stand long uninjured by time and unscathed by casualties, to be a house of prayer, and a place of spiritual blessings to generations yet unborn.